ISU, but it's different now.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for your patience. It's great to see so many people out here, especially on such a nasty night. So I'm Carl Weinberg. I'm a senior lecturer in the College of Arts and Sciences at IU. I want to welcome you to our panel tonight, The Politics of Midwestern Meat, Labor, Business, and the Environment. I teach in the Liberal Arts and Management program, LAMP, the Political and Civic Engagement program, PACE, as well as in the History department. I organized this panel discussion in conjunction with a senior seminar in the LAMP program called The Meat We Eat. A number of our panelists had spoken to the class in previous semesters, but once I heard that this themester was all about food, I thought that we had an opportunity to do something bigger, and apparently I was right. I thought, there are so many connections, there are so many issues connected to meat that the people will be interested in talking about. Why not wait until the weather gets really cold and nasty and it gets dark early and then have a big public forum? So here we are. Welcome to our expanded classroom, and thank you very much for coming out tonight. The plan is that I will introduce all the speakers. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for discussion, questions, and comments from you. Before we get to that, I'd like to first thank some programs on campus and individuals for helping to make this event possible. Funding for the event was provided for the Themester Fall 2014 Office of the IU College of Arts and Sciences, from the Liberal Arts and Management program, LAMP, from Political and Civic Engagement, PACE. Other co-sponsors include the School of Public and Environmental Affairs and the Integrated Program on the Environment. I'd also like to give some special thanks to the following people: Tracy B., the Themester coordinator, Professor Richard Wilk, and the rest of the advisory committee for Themester, which awarded me a co-curricular grant to put this event on, Stone Earn, Ashley Hendricks, student interns at Themester for helping to get the word out, Lisa Havlat, a graphic design Themester intern for designing the poster for tonight, Nick Champagne, who's back there videotaping, Amanda Harper at LAMP, who helped with all kinds of aspects of this event. And then, of course, all of our panelists who agreed to participate in an event in which each of them only gets to deliver a 10-minute talk and then subject themselves to a freewheeling discussion, which might go in many different directions. I have assured them, by the way, that it may be freewheeling, but it will be civil. And I look forward to that. Last but not least, I want to thank all my students in the course, The Meat We Eat, who are here tonight and have put up with my obsession with meat for the last few months. I'd like to next introduce our panelists all together and in the order in which they will speak, and then they will speak with you a little bit. First, to my left is Barbara Shea Cox. She is part of a fourth-generation farm family where she and her husband own and manage a farm near Richmond, Indiana. She graduated from Ball State University with a degree in nursing. She has 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Her retirement goal was to spend time at the farm, but alas, things changed when concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, came to her county. She founded Indiana CAFO Watch around 2003. Her story has been told in Animal Factory, a book published in 2010 and written by best-selling author and journalist David Kirby. She has received several environmental awards here in Indiana, as well as a certificate of special recognition from the U.S. House of Representatives. Our second speaker will be Josh Trenery. Since 2013, Josh has served as the executive director of the Indiana Pork Producers Association. He previously served as the group's director of business development. He's responsible for advocacy activities at the local and state levels for legislative and regulatory issues and is in charge of membership. He grew up on a corn, soybean, and livestock farm in Clinton County, Indiana. He got a degree in management from Purdue University and a law degree from IUPUI. He is also appointed to the National Pork Producers Council's Environmental Policy Committee, as well as being vice chair of the Agricultural Law section of the Indiana State Bar Association and a member of the American Agricultural Law Association. Our third speaker is Larry Howard. He's from Evansville, Indiana. He has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Rose-Hulman Institute and a master's in information science from IU. Since 2003, Larry, his wife Tina, and their 3 children have run Maple Valley Farm, a pasture-based livestock farm in Bloomington, Indiana. I can personally attest that the kids, ages 9, 11, and 13 definitely pull their weight on this farm, and they're here with us here tonight. Together, the family raises cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, turkeys, meat chickens, laying hens, and rabbits in a continuous movement pasture-based system, and recently began experimenting with raising tilapia and garden crops using aquaponics. They've been involved in helping get recent legislation passed, including provisions to reinstate the federal poultry exemption in Indiana, enabling the on-farm processing of poultry, eliminating local licensing and inspection of egg producers, and introducing on-farm processing of rabbits. Our fourth speaker is Ellen Vera. She has been a bilingual labor organizer for the past 7 years for the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 75 in Cincinnati. She's worked on the union organizing campaigns, a variety of union organizing campaigns in the food industry and food processing and packing industry. She's on the board of the Cincinnati Union Cooperative Initiative, of which she's a founding member. She has also recently started a union worker cooperative farm and food hub called Our Harvest Cooperative, and is currently working on starting a multi-stakeholder grocery worker cooperative called Apple Street Market. She has a degree in peace studies from Chapman University, a certificate in Latin American studies from the University of Cincinnati, and will be graduating with an MBA from Northern Kentucky University in 2016. Last but not least, our fifth speaker is Senator Mark Stoops. He was elected to office in 2012 to represent State Senate District 40, which includes IU and the majority of Monroe County. Born and raised in Indiana, Stoops is the fourth generation of his family to live in Bloomington and Monroe County, and is descended from families that settled in Indiana before it was a state. Graduate of Crown Point High School, he attended IU Bloomington and UCLA. He previously served as president of the Monroe County Board of Commissioners and as past president of the Monroe County Council. He's proud of his many accomplishments for his district as an elected official in Monroe County, including creation of the Environmental Quality and Sustainability Commission. Stoops also works as a graphic design and marketing consultant. In the state Senate, he has been appointed to serve as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Environmental Affairs Committee. He also serves on the Senate Corrections and Criminal Law, Financial Institutions, Health and Provider Services, Insurance, and Local Government Committees. Let's just give a round of applause for all of our panelists. And so we will now start with Barbara Shea Cox.
Thank you, Dr. Weinberg, for the opportunity to speak tonight. I have one question.
Yes.
Are you going to give a 2-minute warning?
How about a 1-minute warning? You want a 2-minute warning?
I talk too much.
I do 2-minute warnings, that's fine.
Okay, okay, thank you. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. It's a very cold night, and I really appreciate, can I put this down?
Yep.
Appreciate everyone coming. I do have asthma, and I've really been fighting it the last couple days, so if my voice breaks or I start coughing, please forgive me. This cold weather is hard. Did everyone get one of these sheets? I kind of made out a cheat sheet. We have a Indiana CAFO Watch is a grassroots group. There's no paid people. We're all grassroots people that care about the environment and our resources. And so on our website, we have 98 pages of information. However, I thought for what we're going to talk about tonight, this might be a good cheat sheet for everyone. So I have broken my talk down to 5 issues. And these are the 5 that we have the most concern about. It's water, air, health, property values, and depreciation. And the 5th I have made into 2 categories. It's animal welfare and food safety. On the water issue, we feel that there is not enough regulation, not enough setback, and not enough enforcement of agriculture. And I am 4th generation farmer, so I am not opposed to agriculture. But I think I can say this statement with very good reason. If you will look at the 303D list of impaired waters in the state of Indiana, and then you look at the blue-green algae that has occurred all over the state, our reservoirs, our lakes this year, many of us drink water from there. it is imperative that we keep the nitrogen and the phosphorus runoff out of those lakes and reservoirs. So this is very important. And then we look at Toledo, Lake Erie, Toledo water crisis. They know what it's like to be without water. Water is our common denominator, so we must take care of the water. And Lake Erie right now, they are working so hard to get it back to where it could be. And I hope many of you realize that the Gulf of Mexico now has a dead zone the size of Connecticut from all the runoff from the other states. So this is concern. Now I want to move quickly. I don't want my 2-minute warning tour. Like air pollution. When you drive through the country and you get this whiff of this awful whiff of stench, some people say, oh, that's money. Well, that isn't always the case. Because when you smell that stench, the things you are smelling is hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and small particulate matter. Now, these are of deep concern. And I could give you story after story that I have personally seen. I have been in their homes. And so we need better setbacks. We're all on this planet together. And somehow we have to make it work. And when we go into the air pollution, into the health aspect of it, chronic sinus problems, chronic respiratory, and in people that have asthma like I do, it's very hard on them. And then I think probably the thing that most people feel is on the mind, in 2013, the CDC did a study, and it is one of your links on here, and I would encourage everybody to open it and read it. They said that 2 million people acquire infections that are resistant to one or more antibiotics in a year. 23,000 of those people will die. Now, there is the case that doctors do prescribe too many antibiotics. But also, they are feeding antibiotics to so many of the animals that's not therapeutic. It has been used as a growth promotion. Now, the FDA is very concerned about this, and they are asking for tracking of the antibiotics. They're asking for voluntary reduction of it. I respectfully submit that it shouldn't be voluntary, that we need to get a hold of these antibiotics. And just today I read where they're going to postpone this, tracing them for another year. We have too much to lose. The University of Edinburgh in United Kingdom, they just finished a study. It just came out. And there is a link between livestock and people. Now, I want to be perfectly clear on the MRSA. MRSA comes in many different strains. So you can't blame all that's in the hospital and in the locker rooms. You cannot blame that on the livestock. It's strain 398 that is the critical one that will cause issues in people and livestock. But I think this is one of the most critical things, that we are going into a world maybe that we won't have antibiotics. I grew up in a world like that. My next door neighbor, who was just 2 years older than I am, died of appendicitis because at that time there was no antibiotics to use. Folks, this is a serious issue. And then I go on down to property value. Many times, depending on where the place is located, the site of the confined animal feeding operation, depending on the fans, the 2 studies that I have put on here show that 30% reduction in your property. It's portrayed that we are all people that just moved to the country. No, many of us have been there for generation after generation. And when they come in and they say the setbacks, now, please understand, Indiana is a home rule state. So each county can make their own setbacks. But when you take, the setbacks are not from the property line. They're from the structure. So in essence, I own this, I'm paying taxes on this, but they want to put a CAFO here, so they're going to use part of my land for a setback. To me, that is the most un-American thing you can do. And I know where people can't even build something on their own property that they own because the setback was from the structure. Thank you. I'll move on. Okay, and then I still want to go back to the antibiotic resistance. I think I want to go back to something that's important. When they give them the antibiotics, then they get a antibiotic resistance in their gut. So this meat then goes to slaughter and to market. If it's not handled properly, then that goes to the people. And then that gets in the people's gut. And the other big thing is that when the manure that has the antibiotics in it, research has shown that there will be uptake of those antibiotics into the food. So that is how we end up with the antibiotic resistance in our gut. Next is, and I'll wrap up real quickly here, is animal welfare and food safety. Animal welfare is so important. That is the reason I put it with the food, is because the way the animal raised has a huge impact on what the food is like. If they're stressed out, if they are cramped up, they live in their own feces, would you have a product like you would have otherwise? It is very important that we see the connection between the way the animal raised. Even, I know the moral issue is huge, and I'm all for that, but even for people that are not sensitive to the love and care of animals, my dad always said, you take care of the animals will take care of themselves. And that is very, very important to do that. I would like to say, in wrapping up, that I believe there is a common ground. I believe if we would all sit down at the table, this could be worked out. We all share this planet. We all need to work together to make sure that the people are taken care of, as well as promote agriculture. And I ask each one of you to get involved. Vote with your fork, get involved in legislation, be part of the issue. Thank you.
All right, my name is Josh Trinary. I'm the Executive Director of Indiana Pork. I thank Professor Weinberg for the opportunity to be here tonight. I was in one of his classes, yeah, okay. And so my knee-jerk is usually to start counter-arguing Barbara right away, but then you guys wouldn't get your intro. So I want to kind of give you an overview of what the industry looks like. Before I do that, I only took my third year of law school at IUND so that no one gets offended. Let's see. We'll talk a little bit about how the pork industry is set up in Indiana, the different types of operations that are out there, so you kind of get a lay of the land, and how some of the CAFO-sized farms are different from other types of CAFO-sized farms. So, first of all, anyone in the pork industry is held to a professional standard. So you get a professional standard from your industry, you get a professional standard from the way your producers have to have a commitment to their community, to their neighbors, and to the other producers in their county. You have set industry standards that you're expected to meet. Then you have a series of animal care regulations from the Indiana State Board of Animal Health. You've got design and construction regulations that you have to meet, and you've got operational regulations that you have to meet. And this is no matter what size of pork operation you are. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the sizes of pork operations that have to put these types of values into play. You've got the small, independent farmer that's what's called a farrow to finish operation. So on one side or maybe multiple sites that the same person or entity owns, you've got sows having pigs. You're raising those pigs to a weight where they can go into a finishing facility. And then in that finishing facility, they are raised up to market weight, and then they go to market. All happening under one roof or multiple roofs owned by the same guy, basically. The next type of model you have would be where people get a little bigger to take a more advantage of economies of scale and specialize a little bit. So maybe farrow to finish wasn't penciling out for someone, so they still own all the animals, but maybe they just farrow pigs. They just have sows, raise baby pigs, sell those baby pigs. You can have other specialized operations that just take in wean pigs and raise them to what's called feeder size, meaning that intermittent period between when they're still with the sow to when they go into a finishing facility. And then you've got other specialized facilities that maybe take them from that feeder stage or even from a wean stage and raise them clear through into when they're market weight. All those entities, all those specialized, they're still owning the barns, owning their own pigs and everything. The third type of operation you might have is where you've got a large company that's producing a lot of pigs, baby pigs. And rather than owning and constructing all of the finishing facilities for all those pigs, they look around for farmers in a certain area, and they consider proximity to a feed mill, so they don't have to haul the feed so far, things like that. They look for farmers who want to raise livestock. Those farmers maybe have the wherewithal to construct an animal feeding operation, and they will contract their pig raising services to that sow owner that's producing those pigs, and they'll raise those pigs in their barns. So the farmer, in that sense, that's finishing the animals still has the ownership of the livestock building. It's a family-owned operation in 90-some% of the cases, or a corporate-owned operation that's just made up of the family members, just like lots of farming operations are, be it crop or otherwise. And those folks will raise those pigs to finish weight, and then the company that owns the pigs will market them. So at that point, they're a contractor for the pig owner, but they still have skin in the game because they're owning the barns. And that situation is good because it makes it, in a lot of cases, it's making it economically viable for a lot of children when they get out of high school or college to go back to the family farm if maybe crop farming isn't in the cards for that particular family. They can do something like this where they construct a livestock barn, they pay it off usually over the course of 8 or 10 years, and after that they have ownership in this barn, and then they can contract with a company to raise pigs in it. So I kind of want to give you a lay of the land of what all we're talking about tonight. When Barbara uses the term CAFO, she's talking about a CAFO size operation for pigs anyway would be something that has 2,499 head of pigs 55 pounds or over. That's kind of the federal definition of a CAFO. Doesn't really mean much anymore after the Fifth Circuit decision back in 2009, I think, because the Fifth Circuit said that it used to be that if you were that size, if you were that 2,500 head and up, you had to get a federal permit. Now, federal permitting is only based on whether or not that barn discharges. The way those size barns are constructed, they're considered zero discharge operations. So all the manure in those operations is stored in a sealed concrete pit, and then it's land applied as nutrients for crops at agronomic rates. So right now, based on that new circuit ruling, I think there's like 6 actual NPDS permitted facilities in Indiana, and that's usually because of something like non-contact cooling water for a dairy, something that's cooling off a livestock barn or something like that, and they're directly discharging water out of a barn. So CAFO is still a term that has animal number attached to it, but it doesn't mean anything anymore in Indiana as far as permitting. Whether you're clear down to 500 head, clear up to 8,000 head, you're subject to the same set of standards in Indiana now. It's a level playing field. And Indiana's been regulating livestock since 1971, since before the Clean Water Act even existed. So let's talk a little bit about land application of manure, because that's a lot of what Barbara touched on in her talk was environmental concerns. Manure has to be applied at agronomic rates, and to determine those agronomic rates, you have to do soil tests. You see what the nitrogen and phosphorus loading is, you figure out what the allowable amount you can land apply is and what the crop is going to need for that next year, and you come out somewhere in the middle. When you hear that Indiana's being overrun with livestock operations, just keep in mind that when people say that, there's only 3.6% of Indiana's cropland that's actually receiving manure. Everything else is receiving commercial fertilizer that's petroleum based. All crops need fertilizer. The other 97 or whatever percent is still getting that fertilizer. They're just buying it from a fertilizer dealer. If you're land applying manure, you're getting it from a natural source. You're getting it from the pig, but it's the same nutrients and it's the same water quality issues. The only difference being that the manure is more highly regulated than the commercial fertilizer. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Larry Howard. Thank you, Carl, for setting this up. I appreciate it. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk to people who are interested in this topic, and I know some of you have to be here, and I hope that you'll enjoy this as well. I really think that, first of all, what we're doing, I'm going to talk about politics, and then I'm going to talk about meat, and I'm going to talk about meat and politics, and then I'm going to talk about both of them together. But before I say that, I want to talk about, I do want to say that I think that what we're doing as a small, sustainable type of farm is revolutionary in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that to sound like it's some big thing, but at the same time, what we eat, the food that we eat, and the impact that it has on us all is incredible. We all depend on it, and collectively we depend on it for our well-being. And so anything that can drastically change where our food is coming from, the nutrition of our food, how it's produced, is going to be inherently revolutionary to some respect. And I really feel like what we're doing is revolutionary, not just in terms of what we produce and its health impact, but also in terms of the environment. I think it has the potential, at least the things that we intend to do, to be socially revolutionary. I think it has the potential to be economically revolutionary, and I can talk about those things a little bit later when we ask questions. In terms of meat, what do? I would say that the description of our methodology in farming is continuous motion, high density, high impact, short duration, herbivorous, solar conversion, lignified carbon fertilization on perennial pasture. And thanks to Joel Salatin for some of those words. You've probably heard that before. What that means, though, is that we are using something called biomimicry to mimic nature in the way that we raise the animals. And what this allows us to do is to raise healthy, nutritious animals without using any antibiotics, without using any hormones, without using any chemical fertilizers, without using dewormers, and without doing a lot of the other crutching up genetically that is done in other forms of farming that we recognize have caused a lot of weakness in the overall herd that we have here in the United States. When we got into this, we selected some sheep for our pastures, pretty much to keep the sheep down, to keep the pastures down, so we didn't have to mow them and to be able to eat meat. What we didn't realize was the amount of veterinary care that had to go into that, and it's quite extensive. And we quickly realized that this didn't make a lot of sense to us, because we know that in other parts of the world, in the mountains of Turkey, for instance, they're not using Elanco dewormers every 6 weeks, and yet their sheep somehow live. And we started asking questions, why does that happen? And a lot of it is that we have a lot of people who really care for animals in this country, and we tend to treat them like, I know on a massive scale it doesn't seem like this, but we treat them for any condition that they have, and to the point where we're even feeding them antibiotics in a subtherapeutic manner, which means we're feeding antibiotics to animals that aren't actually sick because it helps them grow faster. They can stay alive long enough to get to the butcher, okay? And we're breeding those animals back, and so we get a weaker genetic herd. What we've done is we take the animals, put them into a natural environment, and over time, the animals are becoming adapted to that environment. They're becoming strong enough that they can live on pasture, have birth on pasture, and all the things that we were told when we first got the sheep that we had to bring them all into the barn, put them in little jugs so that they could recognize their own lambs and keep them in there for several weeks, or they wouldn't be able to keep track of their. And that's true for a lot of commercial animals. We've gotten to the point now where all of our animals, lamb and calve, on pasture without assistance. And so to a lot of farmers that would seem unusual, but it is possible in a few years with some patience and with an investment. And so that's kind of what we do. Now, in terms of the managing the grass and the soil, part of the important thing about what we do is that we actually increase carbon sequestration in the soil, and increase organic matter and fertility. We're doing that by, again, mimicking what nature does. In nature, you have large herds of animals that are multi-species in mobs, grazing one small portion of land in a very dense way at one time and then moving on to fresh pasture or land the next day. The reason they're doing that is because in nature, there are predators. Okay, and so we simulate those predators with an electric fence. We manage this very carefully, and we use a very small portion of our land at any one time. On our farm, we're probably using less than 5% of the overall farm in any one day. In fact, I calculated our poultry operation was using about 1.5% of our farm in one day. So high density, high impact, but very short duration with ample rest is the key to eliminating all these things that current agriculture struggles with. And I don't know if you, Barbara talked about antibiotics and resistance. Well, you do get antibiotic resistance. You also get resistance to all the chemicals that are being used, okay? So if you're using a Roundup Ready herbicide, or a corn, if you're going Roundup Ready corn or soybeans, it's taking, you're producing resistant weeds over time. And now the FDA is just getting ready to approve, or just has approved, a combination of 2,4-D and Roundup, because the Roundup by itself isn't any good anymore, okay, for a lot of weeds. Same thing is true in the animal industry. These wormers that you use, you have to use them for a while until they become ineffective, and then you switch them periodically to try to get over the problem of resistant worms. And so what we're doing is something called refugia. We're raising parasites on our farm. I know that sounds strange, but if you kill off 99.9% of the parasites with some drug, the 0.1% that lives is going to be resistant to that drug. And then it spreads all over the pastures, and that's what you have. So we have a much more natural environment where there's a competition going on between all these different parasites, and the animals are becoming resistant to the parasites. Okay, I'm going to talk about politics a little bit. This is a little bit more on a philosophical level because I want you to know where we're coming from. I think one of the things that's going on when we talk about politics is we are talking about how one person or group can coerce another person or group to do things. And I think that's very unfortunate. That's a lot of the dialogue that we have in politics today. If we get back to more of a common law approach, there are two fundamental principles that we need to follow. One is I will do what I say I'm going to do. That's contract law. The other one is I will not encroach on another person or their property. That's basically tort law. And I feel like if we get back to more of those principles in our political discussions and rely on those fundamental principles, we'll have a much wider distribution of wealth, wider distribution of liberty, and wider distribution of food. So I urge you to kind of think about that as you think about politics. I think one of the reasons we have such a contentious discussion oftentimes is because we're on that first type. I also want to talk about, just real quickly, I'm just about to finish. Let's see here. Sorry about that. Well, about that distribution. One of the reasons that we do what we do is, going back to the economic revolutionary aspects of it, is we want to not just produce food in a different way, we want to distribute it in a different way. And that means getting away from a purely market-driven system to something that's more community-based. And so that means people who are committed to getting their food from a particular place for the rest of their life and paying more when it costs more because it's more scarce or because there's a problem, and paying less when it's more abundant, and kind of owning into that. So I think that's a revolutionary way of approaching it too. Thank you.
My cell phone up here for time so I don't lose track of it. Thank you all again for having me here tonight as well. What a great crew. I'm really impressed that there's so many of you guys here tonight. Again, I am an organizer for United Food and Commercial Workers. We're one of the largest unions in the country, and we represent about 1.3 million food workers all throughout the United States. We represent about 250,000 meat and food processing workers of those 1.3 million. And I work for Local 75, which is based in Ohio mostly. We have a little bit in Indiana, but we represent about 30,000 workers all the way up from the border of Michigan down to Lexington, Kentucky, and like I said, a little bit into kind of Lawrenceburg, Indiana. So, like the professor said, I've been doing this for about 7 years. I've also worked as a community organizer, working on social justice issues, and also as an environmental organizer as well. And in terms of what the union does, and in terms of this whole piece, is I think we're looking at the sustainability of the food system, but we're really kind of looking at it from the aspect of the workers. And we support, definitely the environmental issues that need to be worked on. We support the fact that we need to have, economically sustainable food system. But I think a lot of times people think of sustainability, they forget that worker piece. They think about, how are we, putting these really horrible chemicals into our water, or how are we, how are we paying, these companies, how much are they making? But a lot of times we forget who's processing that food and who's providing the food for us. And I think that's a really important thing when we talk about sustainability, that we can't forget that piece of who is actually doing that work. So it needs to be, if something's going to be sustainable, it needs to be economically sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and socially sustainable. And I think that's the big piece that the labor movement is working on in terms of the food sector itself. So that's kind of a piece of that politics. And so, what we do is we, try to give a voice to that worker in the workplace. We help them come together with their coworkers and to be able to speak to the people who own their company and say, okay, we need to make sure that, we're getting paid a living wage. We need to make sure that we have health care if we're going to work and do, all this work. We need to have full-time jobs. And, we want to be a part of this. If this company is going to prosper, and we want, food processing companies to prosper and do well, we also need to make sure, though, that, the workers themselves are also prospering, and that, there's environmental protections in place and there's safety protections in place as well. Because a lot of times when those chemicals are being used, that really affects the people, not only the animals. So those are some of the pieces that we really, take a big part in. And, I think some other pieces in terms of politics around food is, it's really also around, income inequality and making sure that workers are getting paid well for the work that they do. And that, what type of community do we want to live in? What type of jobs we want to have? Is it a full-time job? Is it a living wage job? The other thing that, we're doing right now, which I think is really, interesting, is we're actually, I think it was said in my bio, but we're also helping to create jobs in our community through food. And we already created a worker-owned farm, an organic farm, and now we're working on a worker-owned grocery store. So those are just some of the pieces in terms of politics that I just wanted to kind of lay out there of like where we're coming from, just making sure that that worker piece doesn't get left behind when we think about what is a sustainable food system. In terms of pork and meat in general, this is kind of the area that I've worked in most of my career in the union on, really working with food workers to try and make sure that their food processing plants are much better. And so one specific example, which I think is part of the reason why I'm here tonight, is we were, just last year, we organized a plant that's called Cincinnati Processing, and it's a pork processing plant. And they cut all of the pork chops that you would find in Kroger's, in the area, in about, a 5-state area. And it's a really interesting story about this plant. It's about 150 workers, and back, it's actually about a little over 20 years ago was when we first tried to organize this plant. So this cutting of pork chops used to happen in Kroger stores by our members. We represent, the Kroger workers, and they were getting paid around, $20-something an hour to, and had benefits, and we're doing all of this work. And the company decided that they wanted to contract that out and, be able to pay less for it. So they created this company called Cincinnati Processing. And so Cincinnati Processing started, and, they were pretty much paying people, minimum wage to do that work. And so the workers reached out to us about 20 years ago and said, hey, we know that this used to be done by workers getting $20 an hour in Kroger stores, and now it's being done at this plant for really, really low, for low wages. So we worked with those workers at that time to form a union, and they had a vote. But unfortunately at that time, there was some issues with the law, and the ballot box was, completely sealed for 3 years. And we didn't find out that we won until 3 years later, and by that time, most of those workers had moved on, and it was really, frustrating for folks. So then kind of fast forward, so there wasn't much we could do at that point. Most of those workers had moved on, and we didn't, have people there that were, knew what had happened and were ready to move forward. So fast forward to when I actually came on staff with the local, in 2008, there were some really serious issues going on in this plant. There were some women who were really being sexually harassed on the line. Workers were getting, cut, and we're having a whole lot of safety issues and just really big issues of disrespect, of being yelled at in their face in front of their coworkers, not being able to go to the bathroom, and just a really, serious problem. And at that point, we formed a workers' rights board where we had, some prominent community members, some religious leaders, some folks, some political leaders, sit on a panel and listen to what these workers were experiencing. And at that time, what we were able to do by the power of the community saying, look, this is in our community. We want to have good jobs here. We don't want that type of stuff happening with our food. They were able to make it so that, two of the supervisors that were doing a lot of these, horrible practices were fired. The workers got a raise, and, things got, a lot better at that point. But unfortunately, a lot of times what we find is when there's no longer that pressure, if there's not a union in there, if there's not a contract, an agreement, that, oftentimes those companies go back into the same practices after that pressure kind of goes away. So, the same types of things were starting to happen again. They weren't getting raises again. And then in 2012, they reached out to us again and said, we did all this, but again, the same bad things are happening. So we, helped them again. We had, over 100 workers coming to meetings and just really saying, we need a voice here. We haven't gotten a raise in 3 years. What can we do here to make this better? And we had an election, but unfortunately, due to a lot of, just intimidation and people being, kind of threatened with their jobs, and a lot of these workers were immigrant workers, and were kind of being threatened around, deportation and some of those issues. Again, they weren't able to get a union in at that point. And again, they had to go back to that in the company. So we're going to make changes. We're going to make this better, and they didn't. And so that was really frustrating to folks. Some of the other issues that they were dealing with, so they were working, 6 to 7 days a week. And, they never knew what their schedule was going to be. They couldn't plan their, their family life. So in addition to, not just economic issues, but also just kind of quality of living issues as well. So finally in 2013, the workers came back to us again. Nothing had changed. And we were able to help them, actually win a union this time. And I think we're really excited for this plant because now, these workers have actually, come to an agreement with the plant, with their owners, saying, okay, this is the raises we're going to get, this is the work schedule we're going to have, they're going to have over $1 raise over the next couple years, and, this is a really big deal for these folks who are, cutting our meat every single day. So I think that that's just one of the things I just want to, leave with folks, and I don't know how close I am, but okay. But it's just that it's really important that when we think about, what type of a food system we want, that we don't forget the workers. It's really important to think about the animals. It's really important to think about the environment. But we also have to remember that, there's folks in there that are doing that work every single day. And so that's, I think, the piece that that the labor movement really brings is that we want to make sure that that piece is not forgotten. And we want to work hand in hand with the other folks as well to make sure that, this type of a food system can be also environmentally and economically sustainable as well. So those are the main things. I think the other just exciting things I wanted to share with you guys is I do think we talk about revolutionary. I think that my local, especially in our union, is really doing some really proactive and revolutionary things. I don't know how many of you guys, obviously you all know about Bloomington Foods here, but the workers there are also trying right now to work with the local here, the UFCW local, to form a union inside their grocery store. And I think that, it's really around a principle of saying that, when workers are working in terms of being able to make the most socially just or most, just working environment, it's important that they have a voice. And so that's what those workers are doing at Bloomington Foods, and it's the same type of thing that, workers in all these different food places are just saying that it's important that we don't get left behind with all of this. I think the other thing I think is just really interesting is that, now, one of the things that, like I said, my local is doing is we're not just going and representing workers at existing places, but we're also helping to create our own jobs. So one of the things that happened, when the economy was really bad is people were really frustrated and they couldn't find jobs. And so, a group of us in Cincinnati said, you know what, whoop, it says that I did 10 minutes. Was just saying that, we don't have to just let this happen. We can also have control on our economy, and we can create our own jobs, and we can create them how we want them. So, for the past 3 years, we've had this co-op, this organic farm that's been functioning, and, we provide something similar to CSA, and, we have folks who are committed to, to buying this really great local food. But it's not just environmentally sustainable, and it's not just economically sustainable, it's also, socially sustainable, because those workers are all part of the union, and they all have good wages, and they have, good benefits. So I just want to make sure that that's the big piece that I wanted to emphasize, is that, for something that's going to be really sustainable, it has to have, all of those pieces. So thank you guys so much.
Oh, I get to finish up here. That's no fun. And I agree, this is a great crowd. I wish we could have many of you up here for committee hearings. Usually when we get committee hearings up at the state legislature, half the room's full of lobbyists, more, probably 2/3 of the room is full of lobbyists, and a handful of citizen representatives that have concerns. I'm Mark Stoops. I'm the state senator for District 40, which is most of Monroe County, Bloomington, IU. I am now one of 10 Democratic senators in the state legislature out of 50. And so, although our voice is getting minimized a bit, all of us are very active and very much interested in protecting the rights of the people in Indiana and the environment over really what I consider an onslaught. When it was interesting to hear the title of the panel is "The Politics of Midwestern Meat," because the industry representation in the legislature is very pervasive. So most of the issues that we deal with are driven by industry industry interest, including the ag industry. So we've had some bills. We've had a bill for a constitutional amendment to the Indiana Constitution called the Right to Farm, which basically says that you have the right to farm, and it specifies modern methods without interference. So that is an attempt to override local regulations, local codes, local property rights. We've had for a couple of years in a row the Ag-Gag bill. It's called Ag-Gag, exactly. And what the Ag-Gag bill did was say that it would be illegal to film any activity in a farming operation. But this is Indiana, so almost immediately they expanded it to any business or industry. It'd be illegal to film any business or industry without express permission from an owner. So, of course, it ran into First Amendment arguments, and eventually that was defeated. But the fear in the industry is that people will see how their food is produced. And they probably should have a fear, because I think if people saw how their food is produced in these mass confined feeding operation methods, it does get a little scary. You have people throwing live piglets and chickens into shredders. You have beaks cut off of chickens without anesthetics. You have ears, tails, genitals cut off of pigs without anesthetics. You have animals dragged to slaughter because they can't get there on their own speed. So all of this is, if you saw that, I think most people, I think a study, 95% of people believe that farm animals should be cared for. And if they find out they're not, then they won't eat those products, and that's pretty logical. So I think the industry has a valid concern from that point. So I am on a compliance advisory panel for the state legislature. And what's interesting is that we have about 1,845 confined feeding operations and CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations in the state. ITEM has inspected 830 of those, and they found 418 violations. So they actually inspected not quite half. They found a considerable number of violations, but they found, basically they fined 8 of those operations an average of about $2,000 a piece. So really, although they identified violations, the fines were minimal and really slap on the wrist. So I think even if you are a confined feeding operation, you're not going to be too concerned about an inspection by item and what that's really going to cost you. On the other hand, ITEM's budget for inspections and enforcement for confined feeding operations is about $2 million. It's over $2 million. So it's a considerable expense to the public, but I don't think we're really getting the inspection and enforcement activity from the state that we might expect. Now, let's see. The other thing I want to talk to you about is as far as the policy of, say, confined feeding operations. You might hear that that's just how it's done. We have confined feeding operations. Those are family farms. They produce more meat because we have a hungry, growing population. But if you look at the actual census, the agricultural census for Indiana, it turns out, and I'm going to have to look at this, I'm going to see if I can do it without having to pull out my glasses. In 1982, there were roughly 18,000, I'm sorry, in 1982 there were 17,654 farms, and they produced 7,279,000 pigs for food. In 2012, there were only 2,800 farms, and those farms produced about 10.5 million pigs. So maybe a 30% increase in the number of pigs that were produced for consumption, but an 85% reduction in the number of farms. So really, do we have to have confined feeding operations? I think obviously no, because if we're talking about a loss of 15,000 farms over that period of time, those were family farms. I mean, those were real family farms. And now we're down to a condensed, just under 3,000 farms that are confined feeding farms by and large. And I had to ask the Farm Bureau that. They were arguing for confined feeding operations, and I said, well, isn't the Farm Bureau always been there to represent family farms? Don't you represent all farms? So why are we changing regulations to incentivize these confined feeding operations? And so I think that has to be the big question. I think worker rights are a big issue, because when I talked about the horrible things that are done in confined feeding operations, there are that it is the workers that are required to do all those things. And I always wonder how that affects the worker coming in at minimum wage, having to do these pretty horrible things day after day. I think they have a number of rights, and I have concerns about that. But even after saying all that, I have hope because one thing I found in Monroe County, Bloomington, Monroe County, we've had the local local food movement. Sorry, my mouth is not working correctly. So we've had the local food movement for, at least 10 years, 10, 12, 15 years. And it's grown. So now most of the restaurants in Bloomington will serve local food, and they make a big deal about it, as they should. And they're very popular. But I just recently took a trip out west, and I was amazed that even in small towns that I went to, restaurants talked about their local food. The fact that they are serving locally grown and sourced food. So I think it's important. I think what this represents is a real bottom-up change in the types of food that people are eating, that they're trying to find in their local markets, and even that they're trying to find in their local stores. So I think that's a good thing. I don't see that changing or going away. I see it growing. So, but anyway, I want to thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. Be happy to take any questions.
I want to thank our panelists again for not only coming here to speak, but sticking to their time limits, which I know is a hard thing to do. So let's give them all a round of applause again on that. Okay, so now that we have heard from the panelists, we will, in just a moment, open the floor for discussion. That means anyone here should feel free to ask a question, make a comment. I will just ask that you make your question or comment relatively brief, so as many people as possible can be part of the discussion. If you have a question, feel free to direct it to any one of the panelists, the whole panel, or to no one in particular. And finally, I'll ask people to speak up so everyone can hear you. So the floor is open.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Lauren Hart, and I have a question for Josh from the pork producers. I'd just like to ask for your response to all the many people from groups like the Humane Society of the United States or various food providers who are saying that pig welfare on the large farms is really leaves a lot to be desired, and that, for example, we should move away from the solitary confinement of mother pigs. My understanding, tell me your take on it, but I think the mother pigs on these large farms where most pork is coming from in Indiana and in our country, the mother pigs are kept in these solitary crates, gestation stalls that are so small that they can't turn around for the majority of their life, and it seems pretty inhumane to me.
Sure. Okay, so gestation stalls, that's been a big issue the past few years. HSUS has went to a lot of retailers asking that they demand a switch from gestation stalls to more open pen design. So you have benefits and negatives with each kind of system. Our main thing is we don't think the government or an outside group should be able to dictate what system we use. I think it ought to be based on what swine vets and other folks that are experts in the field think, and not what an activist group thinks. So we just want it to be based on producer choice, as long as it's meeting the industry standards for animal care. And the fact is that the industry standard for animal care says that either of those two types of production systems work. And we've got guys that have, as soon as they brought their pigs inside in the 70s, started using an open pen system, which is probably what HSUS is more a proponent of. And you've got guys that when they brought their pigs in from outside in the 70s, they've been using a gestation crate system. So in one case, they have more opportunity to move around, but there's a lot of opportunity for fighting amongst themselves in the pen, and it's harder for individual care. If you have a gestation stall, individual care and individual monitoring is a lot easier, and they can't move around or fight and harm those baby pigs. A lot of it comes down to management. Some producers are more comfortable with one style of management than another.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, Senator Stoops, go ahead, and if other people on the panel want to respond after he speaks, you are free to do that.
Okay. Well, I guess first I'd have to say that yes, government has a responsibility in regulating how our food is produced. That's how many of the regulations that promote safety and food quality have come about, because industry can't regulate itself. It doesn't have any incentive to regulate itself. So it's cheaper to produce food by trying to push everything into small crates. When I talked about the fact that they had to cut off ears and tails for pigs, it's because when they're confined so tightly, they literally will bite off the ears and tails of their next door neighbors. And so I think the question the public has to ask is, do we want to eat this food where basically an animal's grown up in this highly stressed environment and then slaughtered in a stressful manner? And what kind of food is that, really? That I assume we're eating the same stress hormones that the animal was emitting when it was growing and killed.
I'm going to respectfully disagree with Senator Stoops in a certain regard. The system that we have, and maybe you would agree with this, the system that we have isn't working. The system that we have that consists of government regulation is not working. A few years ago, the largest outbreak in pasteurized milk was 186,000 people illnesses, and that was highly regulated. I'm very much for raw milk, and we have a system where we have this kind of regulation, yet some of the largest food outbreaks are in greens and in raw milk, or I'm sorry, pasteurized milk. And so that system isn't working very well. And if you want to stop this kind of stuff from happening, you need to regulate it. You people out there who are buying this stuff every day need to tell them, I'm not buying this crap. And then it'll change real fast. So I think there is regulation that's needed, but it's not centralized regulation that's needed. It's distributed regulation, and you need to take responsibility for this. Every one of us here, sitting here, is culpable for this, what's going on. I don't care how much you say you hate it. If you haven't given it up, or if you're not talking to your friends about it, it's partly your fault. So let's stop pushing off responsibility onto some government entity that, by the nature of it, is bureaucratic and is not very efficient. And let's get down to the brass tacks of using our own wallet to make these decisions. That's hopefully answers your question you're asking.
I'll actually agree on both counts. I actually agree that regulation is needed, but I don't think it's very effective.
And does Ellen or Barbara want to
Yeah, I
chime in
do
on
just
that?
want to.
Okay, we're going to give the other panelists a chance to respond to that quick.
Right, and I want to say a both and as well. I think we also need to recognize, though, that a lot of times other ways of processing cost more, and it's important that we pay more because, for farmers to have a living wage and be able to support their families. But I think in the economy that we're in, not everyone has that privilege to be able to spend more on their food. And so at the same time, while those of us who have choice and have the power to buy something else that's produced in a different way should do that, at the same time, those who don't have that privilege because they don't have enough money, we need to make sure that we are regulating the industry in a way that, everyone is getting food that's actually healthy for them.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Directed at Josh. So, this is in regard to workers versus the industry, and it seems like a lot of blame is passed off to workers instead of the industry. For instance, in a lot of undercover investigations afterwards, the workers get fired, and then the industry calls it an isolated incident. So it's also very clear by these investigations that regulations are consistently neglected, and typically the industry blames the workers rather than the industry itself. and it cultivates a culture of inhumane treatment, often against the regulation. So why not let the industry take responsibility for these instances when it is clear that these are not isolated instances by the sheer number of these instances being reported, and these instances inhumanely break regulation, and they see workers getting blame passed on them constantly despite the industry cultivating it.
Okay.
Sure. So, yeah, so if an employee is caught doing something inside a barn, that can be attributed to that employee going off his own outside the scope of his employment, or it can be attributed to poor training. And it's the industry's responsibility to deal with that poor training and make sure those workers know what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, yeah.
Why? Because I don't have any filters? Well, I think employees are doing this because they are, I would say by and large, this is how they're asked to do their job. And if they don't do that, then they are at risk of being fired. And all the methods I talked about earlier, all the terrible things that are done, are all legal processing methods for chickens and pigs. I mean, it's not as if that actually itself, but there are many things that are illegal that are also done. I'm sure there are employees that don't follow the regulations set by the employer, but at the same time, I think this is kind of what's expected within the industry to move that product. And I have to say that there are many individuals that see animals as entities, and there are individuals and corporations that just see them as a product, a widget, doesn't have feelings or is not able to be harmed, doesn't feel pain, or isn't miserable. So
I'm going to give Josh a quick
My opinion.
chance to respond to that.
Yeah, so it doesn't benefit the industry to do anything inhumane. So you do standard industry practices. You have to keep your animals healthy. If you don't keep your animals healthy, you're not going to stay in business. So, there's been generations of progression in the industry ever since we brought the pigs in out of pasture and into confinement. And we've advanced those production practices to the point where some things may look weird to the people that don't see it every day, but the problem is you've got a set of practices that may look weird to the public but may be perfectly fine according to the animal experts. And within that, you have a subset of people that are doing actual inhumane treatment, and those people need to be dealt with. But to say that we're encouraging inhumane treatment, that's an irresponsible statement.
Right, yeah, go ahead.
Hi there. This is kind of an open-ended question. Since there are kind of a lot of substitutes for pork, say chicken or beef or turkey, it means that the elasticity of demand is pretty high. So would an increase in regulations lead to an increase in the price and thus be detrimental to the entire pork industry?
Is that
Good question. Anybody want to take that? Again, anybody else in the audience can take it too, if they'd like.
Yeah, well, with greater regulation comes greater compliance costs. That's clear. So yeah, that's possible. I mean, increased regulation could cause increased costs. That's just an economic truth.
Yeah.
I just go panel and whoever wants to take this. Let's assume we live in a world where people want to eat meat, and it is the government's responsibility it is still the government's responsibility to monitor runoff from farms, monitor how these farms are managed, and we as taxpayers are responsible for fitting the bill ultimately. Which system of farming is better? Several small scattered farms that could be more difficult to regulate, or one or two heavily confined, possibly more efficient farms that may require less regulatory. I'd like to hear from the whole panel on that.
Yeah, sure.
Barbara, did you have something? She hasn't talked
Well,
yet.
go ahead.
I would, go back to what I said before, our farm is heavily regulated. As a small farm, it's regulated by the people who come and pick up their food right at the farm, because they can see what's being done, and they can come on any time. I don't support this law that restricts camera use on a farm, because our doors are open all the time. You can come anytime you want. Now, if it's 2 in the morning, I'm not going to get up for you, but you can come and look at what we're doing. You can go look in our feed room, and you can look at there used to be a medicine shelf there. There's not anything on it anymore. But, you can see that yourself. And I think the best way to regulate farms is to get more people involved in small farms and involved in actually seeing where their food comes from. And so, yeah, if you had one of our farms on every country block, you could definitely feed the world with it. Does that get into your question at all? I mean, I don't know.
Why don't we have a couple more responses here? Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, if I understood your question correctly, I think there are bad actors and good actors in both small farming and in CAFOs, and I use CAFOs, confined feeding operation, interchangeably. But the issue is that if I have 4,000 gallon of manure, or if I have 400,000 gallon of manure, how much more damage am I going to do if I'm a large producer? So that is a concern, that when you have a bad actor that is a CFO or a CAFO, he's going to do 10 times as much damage as the small one. And I personally have seen them spreading in storms that when I get a call and I go out, the manure is running down the roads. And so these are things that need to be stopped. And I really wish that there was a way that the pork producers, and I'm not picking on you, Josh, but pork producers, all your dairy, all of you, could better regulate their own people. Because I think that IDEM doesn't have the money to do it. 600, they have about 3,000 calls a year on the spill line, and they only can address 600 of them. So you see the situation.
Just point of information, by the way, IDEM is Indiana Department of Environmental Management. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah. In case you might be wondering. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Angie. I just want to say thanks for including labor practices in this discussion. It is something that's not widely discussed when we're talking about these topics. But, talking about all the issues at hand here with animal agriculture, I actually have a question for you, Professor. Why was no one invited to be a part of this panel that's discussing alternatives to animal-based agriculture when you look at the environmental effects, human health effects, obvious animal welfare effects?
That's a great question. I thought I might get it, actually. I guess the short answer is that when I designed the composition of the panel, I was thinking about the class I was teaching and thinking about some of the people who had either come to the class as guest speakers in the past, Josh and Barbara, or actually Larry Howard's farm, which we had visited. And so it came out of that. I'm aware that there's a whole other set of issues that could be discussed as part of this. And in fact, in the class, we have a unit on animal rights. We have a unit on animal welfare. It's something that's very much discussed. I do think, though, as a number of people have said, including Ellen, that the public discussion about the meat industry tends to be focused on consumers and animals. And workers and producers, in fact, tend to be often left out of the discussion. So I think, for me, it was important to shift the focus for this event toward those people, and that, and also, of course, I realized we could have had 20 people on the panel talking about all 20 different dimensions, but then there would be no time for this kind of discussion. So that's at least some of my thinking about that. I think that's a good question. Yeah.
My name is Judy Berkshire. Obviously, you can tell from my gray hair that I am a member of the baby boomer generation. And I remember very well growing up on a pig farm where there was not the use of routine antibiotics. And we did bring the sows in out of the field and put them in a barn, but we did not use routine antibiotics with any of our pigs. So my question for the panel is, why do you think there is such a reluctance from what I view as the farm industry, Farm Bureau, the pork producers, and others who represent large farming operations, to any kind of regulation that might limit routine use of antibiotics? And that's not giving them the sign if they're feverish, the pigs are feverish, or they're obviously ill. That's just daily, put it in their feed, give them antibiotics. So my question is, why is there such a reluctance to limit that use in our feed and our animals today?
It's all about the money. It's all, well,
Go ahead.
I'm probably not the expert on this, but it's all about the money, right? It's about how quickly can you get that piglet to slaughter, right? Up to weight and slaughter, and it's all about the money. If you put antibiotics into their feed every single day, they're going to grow a whole lot faster, and you're going to get that money back a lot quicker.
But there has been a backfire, though, because there's diseases that are spreading through the confined feeding operations. For instance, there's a disease now that is just wiping out baby piglets, and it's, I think if you'd like to address that, it's, I'm not sure what percentage of the baby pigs are dying, but that's something that's going on now. And I can't remember, it's fetal pig.
Porcine epidemic.
Yeah,
Diarrhea.
Epidemic diarrhea.
And so as sloppy as it sounds. And that has to do with the confined method of housing the animals, I would think.
Did you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, PED is it's a foreign animal disease that's come into the country, and it's the first time the U.S. has ever had to deal with it. China said there's certain province in China that's had to deal with it for years, and so we've had, if a facility gets infected, it can be almost a total death loss for the baby pigs. So it's been a real hit on the industry and a real hit on morale in the industry. I brought some antibiotics numbers because I knew that would be a big topic tonight. So we've heard some statements about antibiotics, so I just want to kind of give the lay of the land. So just to kind of give you the lay of the regulatory land, in 2003, I've got the dates and some of the numbers here. In 2003, FDA implemented a requirement for approving new animal drugs to where they do a deeper analysis for if they're medically important to humans. And so at that point, if the antibiotic was medically important, it would be a much harder hurdle to get that approved. And if it did get approved for animal use, it was very limited. Then last year, there was FDA guidance. I think didn't you mention 213? The FDA guidance?
They asked for
Yeah.
them,
So-
but they haven't still done anything.
Well, so you're familiar with guidance at the IDEM level too. IDEM will pass the guidance document on a reg. Well, it's sort of the same for FDA. If IDEM passes a guidance doc on a regulatory provision, it's to clarify to the producer how the reg works. Same with FDA. If there's regs on the books, then the guidance document helps clarify how that reg works. So if you don't comply with 213, FDA said that they will take action, and all the animal-based pharmaceutical companies have agreed to comply with 213. So I want to mention a little bit about what 213 did. It asked animal drug manufacturers to stop selling antibiotics that are important in human medicine that are labeled only as growth promotants. And all 26 companies, like I said, agreed to do that. Let's see, I had something else here. So there's a claim here found in an editorial that 70 to 80% of all antibiotics sold in the U.S. each year are used in livestock. So first of all, there's a differentiation between the antibiotics that are medically important to humans and the ones that aren't. So about a third of the drugs that are used aren't important in human medicine. and there's another third that aren't considered what's called highly important to human medicine, and most of them aren't used for growth promotion, but they still are. There still are some that are used for growth promotion in the industry. So, but to give you kind of a sense of scale, we've got 2011 stats here I've got in this. 30 million pounds of antibiotics were sold for use in 3 billion head, I guess, of livestock and poultry, but 7 million pounds were sold for 311 million people. So if you pencil that out, it means each person used about 5 times more antibiotics than were used in each food animal. So I just kind of wanted to give a little clarification on how antibiotic use works. It's not kind of a one-size-fits-all thing.
Okay, thank you.
I want to direct a question to Barbara Cox about property rights. If she could go into a little more detail, maybe with some examples of neighbors to confined feeding operations, of their property rights infringed, and also how Indiana's so-called right to farm law limits their ability to pursue legal action to protect their property rights.
Well, yes, there has been quite an issue, and we've been in discussion of the animals, which is very important and everything, but I don't think if you do not live in the country and you've been there for years and you understand that your world all of a sudden is coming to a halt. It will never be like it was before. When people have been there 3 generations, and all of a sudden, because they are allowed to come up to the structure of your property, and your daughter is crying when she has slumber parties, that the kids all have to go home because it smells so bad at 2 a.m. that you can't stand it. And finally, the parents give up after 3 generations and say, I'm out of here. And this farm just came in. This goes on daily. Property rights dropping. And when you're using somebody else's property for yours, there is one case where the woman was dying in a hospital in Indianapolis. And her family, they had been farmers all their life. And while she was dying over there, a guy that wanted a CAFO came in, and he got his permit at the county, and he used, like, let's say, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like 200 feet of his own property and 800 feet of these other people's property, and now the son cannot build on his dad's property and help them farm. Now, this is a total injustice, that everything should be from property lines and people should have the right. And I'm sorry, this is one of my touchiest subjects because I'm sick and tired of hearing, well, it's you people that came to the country. Well, no. Most of us were there first, and we have to have our property rights addressed.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what would it take to make all of farming be more like running an ecosystem? Because many of these problems you're talking about would disappear. Is the problem the supply and demand? Is there a mismatch? Do workers need to be trained better? Does the price of agri-products need to go? What exactly are the big barriers that we don't run all of farming as a large ecosystem?
Can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear it.
What are the big barriers to making all of farming be more like managing a large ecosystem? As you were describing, instead of using antibiotics, you might have different ways of raising it. You have different animals and plants interacting. So you're basically looking at one large ecosystem versus trying to solve one problem at a time.
It might be surprising, but a lot of the barriers to creating a lot of farms like ours are that corporations are getting huge labor subsidies in the sense that, for instance, property taxes. I mean, if you have what would it be like what's the property tax right now for farms? 3%. You know, that means every 33 years, my son has to, even after I've paid off my property, my son has to repay the current mortgage. And the current mortgage can go up in value regardless of what our production is. If we keep the same production, but we have more expensive houses built around us, our property goes up, and he has to pay that too every 33 years. So you're not going to get a multi-generational farming system where the land stays and is stewarded and cared for under that kind of a system. So that's just one example, but there's all kinds of other economic examples. And I think you might be talking also about just the logistical hurdles and the natural hurdles, but there are all kinds of problems like that. And I think the other thing I alluded to before is just the consumer demanding that as opposed to the other system is, I think, critical.
I totally agree. Oh, excuse me, John. I totally agree. You, the consumer, are the answer with your demands. And not just at the grocery store. Every restaurant you eat in. When you buy milk, if it doesn't have the RBGH-free milk, leave it set. Whatever you do, be a part of the system. And as Senator Stoops mentioned, we need people down there at the State House, not just lobbyists. We, the people, need to be heard.
I'd like to recommend, anybody who's interested in this, there's a great article from 2006 Rolling Stone about Smithfield pork farming in North Carolina, and it will, you'll never look at pigs the same way again after you read this. But I'd like to know, particularly from Senator Stoops, what prevents Indiana from creating a farming system like North Carolina has now, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of acres that are uninhabitable. People are not crying over birthday parties, Barbara. They can't walk in their own yards without having severe health effects.
Well, I think Indiana's regulatory environment is pretty lax compared to many states. So I'm not, I guess the question is, how do we keep it from getting worse? Is that right? Well, I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but the last year, I think Indiana approved another 94 CAFOs in Indiana. They had 94 applications for new CAFOs. They approved 93. And the only one that they didn't approve is because the person hadn't filled out all their paperwork. So it wasn't really a matter of somebody having a CAFO in a inappropriate area getting denied. Every CAFO application was approved, except for the one that didn't fill out a blank somewhere.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in. So from the regulatory standpoint, we've heard a lot about violations. So I pulled up the violations statistics from IDEM. So if you look at the violations stats for IDEM and look at CFOs versus CAFOs, and again, Senator Stoops was referring to CFOs, confined feeding operations, a lot in your talk, but remember that CFOs is anything 600 head of pigs and up. So you're casting dispersions on some pretty small farms when you refer to confined feeding operations. It's confined animal feeding operations is probably what you want to talk about if you're talking about the ones that are 2,500 head.
Right.
Just,
well, if
just
you
so
notice,
know.
I bundled the figures. You got confined feeding operations, confined animal feeding.
Okay, so if you look at the different types of violations, notices of violations issued were 23 for CFO and CASEFO enforcement actions from July 1st, 2013 to June 30th, 2014. So of those, if you look at agreed orders and civil penalties for water quality violations, you're looking at 8 for confined feeding operations and 0 for the confined animal feeding operations, the larger size operations. So the other types of violations you could have would be like construction requirement violations that have to get corrected, or permit or approval violations, which could be like approval conditions based on paperwork violations or stuff. But IDEM's own numbers, the water quality violations, there were 8. They were all confined feeding operations, means those barns were lower than 2,500 head, and that was all the water quality violations there were, which means it's the only violations that actually caused environmental.
May I say something, please?
Go ahead. I just want to say that just proves the point that Indiana is not enforcing their regulations, and the fact that they only had a couple $1,000s in penalties for 8 violations, when these ponds leak, that's a major problem. I mean, that's major damage all the way downstream. So the fact is, Indiana doesn't enforce. We don't have that many inspectors. When we do catch somebody, if it's a big operator, they're not going to get fined. They're going to get a slap with it. Why don't you fix that? Well, I'll get to it. And then the smaller ones have less pull, so I can imagine that the smaller ones probably get more the brunt of the regulations a little bit more.
The big ones get quite a bit more of the scrutiny, however, and they're right. I mean, items understaffed, they don't have very many inspectors, and they run the program at some, I mean, I don't know, a few years ago, it was a $1.4 million deficit. I think it might be more than that now.
But do you really believe in all of Indiana that there's only for those agreed orders that whatever it is, $8,000 or $11,000 would be an appropriate amount of fines when we know that these violations are taking place?
You have to have a spill into a water body that caused harm, which means there has to be like a fish kill or something, which is pretty darn easy to see. I mean, it doesn't take an inspector to turn in a fish kill. I mean, so yeah.
Well, I'd like to say
Let's
something.
have Barbara jump
I'd
in
like
first.
to say something. I personally have been out and I have seen these violations, and I have called IDEM, and I have sent them to them. And on the one I mentioned about when they were putting in a pouring down rain and you could see the manure running down the road, and they said, well, we can't find the outlet to get the test. Well, no, it was out in the road. So I have had a lot of experience where they have been called, they did not come in a timely manner, and I'm not putting because they don't have enough people. But then I think that goes back to what Senator Stoops said. If they would fine them more, then they would have more money for the program. So, but I personally have seen a lot more violations in a year than that myself.
So Barbara does bring up a good point, which is the population of Indiana can be the inspectors on the ground for a lot of this stuff. If you see something that you don't think looks right, call IDEM, turn them in, have them come out and look at it. I mean, they're obligated to come and check it out, so do it. I mean, the more of these anecdotes we don't have, the better off we are. I'm representing the whole industry, but I don't represent every producer in it, so turn them in.
So folks, I don't want to get in the way of this discussion. Great discussion we're having. I do notice people are peeling off and starting to go, and I'd also like to give people a chance to just talk informally with the panelists, eat some of the lovely food we have over there. Maybe we can have a few more questions or comments and then break for some informal discussion. I want to call on people who have not spoken yet. Go ahead.
I'd like to thank everybody coming out tonight. All five of you bring something different to the table. I'd just like to point out a couple things and end with a question. From what I found out, it looks like 23.3 billion pounds of pork was produced in 2012, and that includes exports. Of local farmers, if they all produce only 2,000 pounds, that would take 11,650,000 farms to produce that. So my question would be, here after my comment, how do we get to that number to, if we're concerned about CAFOs, but also, one of the greatest things, we live in the United States and we have a choice, so we can pick local, we can pick whatever we want to eat, and that's one of the greatest things about living in one of the richest nations. Then also I'd like to point out when we talk about regulating, if we could regulate all the bad people, we'd have no need for jails.
So
Sounds good to me.
I want to touch on one of his points if I can.
Go for it.
So you're right about the choice thing. Our industry doesn't cast any dispersions on the type of product that you grow. We don't refer to it as crap, I think is the word you used about the commercial pork production a few minutes ago. Yeah. You said something about eating that crap. But so no, we don't cast dispersions on locally grown organic folks. It's a choice thing. If that's important to the consumer, then they can buy it. But we have a safe, affordable product. It's a lower cost alternative.
Okay, let me address that. First of all, how many of you heard about raloxifene? Paling? No, this is the kind of stuff that they're putting into pork, beef, and chicken and turkey now to produce leaner meat. It's allowed to be fed right up till the day of butcher. It was taken off the FDA taken off the market by the FDA because it was used as an inhaler medicine. It killed some people. So when I say crap, first of all, I'm sorry about that if I offend you, but I'm talking about the American diet in general. A lot of the stuff that we do is crap. That's one thing. Have anybody heard of Baker's Green Acres up in Michigan? The Department of Natural Resources and the pork producers of Michigan, which is not cast aspersions on ours because I don't know if it was all the same. But they got together and they pretty much outlawed every kind of pig other than the standard industry pig. And so the farmers were ordered to kill their pigs if they had, because they were called feral pigs. The definition of a feral pig was anything that wasn't the standard industry standard pig. So this is the kind of collusion that goes on between these groups and the government that really gets me up, my hackles up, because that's just ridiculous. I mean, this guy has pigs on his property that, because they're a heritage breed, are now feral because they have long hair and straight tails or curly tails. I mean, that's how ridiculous it was. So
yeah, he's right about that. The feral pig thing in Michigan did get out of hand because
yeah.
there is a feral pig problem where they're an invasive species, but if you don't define it right at the regulatory level, it casts too wide a net, and our folks in Indiana have done a pretty good job of rationing that in to control the feral pigs without touching the heritage breed.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of things Melissa said. I think there definitely is an issue in terms of we have to have enough food for everyone, right, to feed everybody. And I think that our farming system, was able to do that, 40, 50 years ago, and it has changed so much that there would be a huge issue, and there's not that many people out there that want to farm or even know how to farm. So I think we have lost a lot of that, that knowledge base on how to farm, and I think it would take, a really big change, society-wise to be able to get back to some of those things. But I think it's a question of what are we going to allow? What are we, if we just let industry regulate itself, we know that the mighty dollar is what's most important, and that's what happens in whether it's environmental environmental issues, worker rights issues, all of those things. The dollar at the end of the day is what speaks the loudest. So I think in terms of regulation and in terms of trying to get back to something that's what a lot of people consider more sustainable, we have to take steps, and it's going to be a process. We can't just suddenly go to all family farms that are going to be able to feed everybody right now because we don't have the people to do that at this point.
So I'm going to take one more question or comment and then give people on the panel a chance to say one last thing if they'd like to. Right here.
Yeah, I'd like to just point out that when you said one way to see if they're polluting is to see how many dead fish are in the creek.
Yeah, an actual water quality violation. That's one way to tell.
Where I analyze the water and the little streams that run through near Capo, and I report that diligently. Nothing is ever done because, I'm not an official, I may be a nuclear scientist, but I don't count in terms of I'm not employed by the U.S. government. So, if a stream is polluted very badly, which falls into a little bit larger stream, which flows into, let's think of this little Dole's Ditch, which goes into a Bachelor Run, which runs into Deer Creek, which runs into the Wabash.
Right.
And when you see them I shouldn't say this, accidentally I took some pictures of a snowstorm, and there happened to be a farmer out there spraying manure.
Yeah, turn them in. If they don't have an exemption, it's illegal.
Yeah.
But they don't do anything.
Oh my gosh, I broke the law.
They write them up for frozen ground land application if they catch them. I could show you the violation list.
Well, right. Not enough.
So the point is, you can suggest statistics, but the statistics, when we lived on a farm, I had a river that ran, or creek, ran 3/4 of the way around our property, and we were continuously getting manure in our small streams because they have standpipes in all the fields that might hold a little bit of water. And when they spray manure on top of frozen land or on top of land, and it rains, it collects in these hollows, and that's why the standpipes are there. And guess where the standpipes go? Directly into the nearest stream. It's a fast road.
Okay, so a couple things. There's point source runoff and there's non-point source runoff. They can both affect water quality when they end up in a ditch or a stream. So if you land apply your nutrients at agronomic rates and according to the regs, and there's a rainstorm or something, but you've done everything correctly, that would be considered non-point source runoff. It's not a regulatable type of discharge. It's just the type of discharge any other crop farmer would have off of his land for applying commercial fertilizer and having the same type of runoff that goes into a ditch or something. What you're talking about with frozen ground or land application when it's snow covered, if it's the CAFO or CFO operator doing that, and it's on his own ground under his control, that's against the terms of his permit. So if it's against your terms of your permit, it's by definition not at an agronomic rate, which means it can be considered a point source of discharge, which means if they find it in the water and can tell that it was him through the standpipe or whatever you're talking about, or surface drain in the field, then you can turn that guy in. So we're kind of talking about two different types of pollution here.
Operators contract out to non-farmers.
Right, and so if the operator if the operator contracts out to non-farmers and he land applies that manure on ground that is under that permit holder's control, it still applies. All the regs that apply to the permit holder apply to the contractor.
Not enforced, because we have multiple times brought that to the point.
Turn them in, and turn them in, and if you're turning them in and you think they're doing something against the regs and you don't feel like it's getting checked out, remember that those types of land application regs are within the confined feeding permit, but they're also within the state chemist fertilizer use rule. And if you're land applying manure from a confined feeding operation, you have to be certified under Cat 14 license by the state chemist's office. If you don't think you're getting a response from IDEM, call the state chemist's office, and if they can't get somebody to come out, let them call IDEM. They have a memorandum of understanding between them. So if you can't get IDEM to respond, have the state chemist call IDEM and let them argue with them and get them to go out there, because the state chemist doesn't want that non-response on their record either. So
folks, this has been an extremely educational exchange in a lot of different ways. I do want to give the other panelists just a chance to throw in a few last words before we break things up. So maybe we'll just start with Barbara, if you'd like to add something.
Well, I'd just like to say that what Josh said, turn them in. And, but don't ever have a problem on Saturday or Sunday, because if you see water manure that is right next to the river and you call IDEM and it is a out-of-state manure coming in, and they say, well, you'll have to wait till Monday morning, because that's the state chemist's job. I would encourage everybody in here to talk to your legislators and to call the state chemist office and IDEM and tell them that the state chemist office needs to be on the spill line on the weekends, because I was frantic with all that going into the river and no way to do anything about it on a Saturday night. So this could save a lot of problems. Again, I say, everybody, get involved every way you can. Be part of the solution. We will find a solution.
So DNR has a lot of boots on the ground too. So if you see an issue like that and you're worried about somebody coming out, they have response folks too that can come out and show up on the scene. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to raise pork. There's a lot of regulations on the books. By and large, most of my guys do it right, or I wouldn't be working for them. I grew up on a livestock farm. I know how it works. We're not inherently evil people. A lot of times I think that's what some people think. Once you get to some scale, you suddenly become corporate or evil. A 1,500-acre farmer, which is a pretty small farmer in this day and age, can be the size of farmer that would build one of these buildings so he could have some kids come back to the farm. That's a family farm. I mean, whether you want it to be or not, that's what one is now.
Yeah, I would just say that, as you see here, this can be very contentious with all this discussion of the regulations and everything. And Albert Einstein, I think, was the one who said, if we continue doing the same things and yet expect different results, that's the definition of insanity. And I think what we're doing here is we're just trying to add more and more of this back and forth in regulation. I don't think is the solution. I think the solution is to change the system. And if you want the system to change, like Barbara said, you need to get personally involved and put your money where your mouth is. Patronize smaller farms. Get your food from a person you know. And you're not going to be able to do that from a grocery store shelf. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody again for being here tonight. And I think everyone's kind of set it down the line here, but I think, again, it is just so important that we know where our food comes from, the conditions with which our food is raised or made, and that every single person, involved in that, from, the environment to the worker to, to the people that are eating it themselves. So I think that it's on all of us, because again, I would say I think it's so important that we do put our money where our mouth is, but I think it's also important that we remember that there's a lot of people who can't do that as easily. And so I think it's really important that we are just, advocating for the right, types of practices that we all want to eat, that type of food that's, done in that way. Because I think, we can't just say, I think I agree with you, like we're in America, we can do what we want, but I think not everybody has that freedom to be able to buy exactly what they, believe in. So, thank you.
I was interested to hear about the number of calls to item. That's something I didn't know, and I think I'm going to have to look into it. If they get 3,000 calls and they're only going out and visiting a few farms, and that's not appropriate as well. So that's something I'll have to look into. But what I got from the statistics is what I find striking, though, that the fact that 30 years ago, there were 18,000 pig farms, and that now there's less than 3,000. But really, they're producing just tens of percents more pigs. So obviously, it can be done. Those smaller farms can produce pigs in probably a more humane fashion. That doesn't address people eating meat, but yes, people have to pay attention to what they're eating, and they have to demand it. And I think that's happening. I think the local food movement is a big movement, and it's grown exponentially, where you even have Walmart selling organics. Well, kind of organics, but they may be from Mexico or Central America. But it's kind of getting there. The demand is there. People are understanding that what they eat is important, and hopefully that consumer demand is we've talked about is what's going to change how our food is produced.
Okay, folks. Well, please feel free to stick around and have some food and drink and talk with the panelists and with each other. Thanks again for a great panel discussion, and thank you all for coming.